Hello, and welcome to the Thoreau Society's program, the last program of our weekend webinar. So this is There Is More Day to Dawn, a global conversation celebrating Thoreau's lasting legacy, sponsored by the Thoreau Society. My name is Michael Frederick. I'm the Executive Director of the Thoreau Society, and I'm here at Thoreau Farm in the birth room where the author Henry David Thoreau was born in 1817. And today's program will be discussing the film Surveyor of the Soul, sponsored in part by Films by Huey. Let me introduce the panelists. For 40 years, Huey has been making films on artists, education, the environment in Maine. His films have been shown at film festivals throughout the US, on PBS, on television in Europe. His seventh feature-length documentary film, Henry David Thoreau, Surveyor of the Soul, had its world premiere at the Maine International Film Festival on July 15, 2017. It was also selected for screening at the Vermont International Film Festival. His film, In Good Time, The Piano Jazz of Marianne McPartland, was selected as a must-have jazz DVD of 2011 by Downbeat Magazine and won the Manny Berlingo Award, Best Feature Documentary, Garden State Film Festival. His 2002 film, Wilderness and Spirit, A Mountain Called Katahdin, was selected for screening at the Environmental Film Festival, National Museum of American History, Washington, D.C. Huey is a founder and director of the Maine Student Film and Video Festival, now in its 41st year. He has been an artist in residence in animation and video production in over 150 schools in New England. He is an adjunct instructor in Communications and New Media, Southern Maine Community College, Southern Portland, Maine. Matthew Schlein has spent 45 years in the public school system, including 27 years as an educator. For the last 20, Matthew has founded and directed the Walden Project, an innovative, internationally recognized public school program where students follow Thoreau's dictum of living deliberately and consciously. Meeting outside through Vermont's 4 seasons, the curriculum emphasizes student choice, as well as writing, environmental studies, and the social sciences. Matthew is also the founder and director of the Willowell Foundation and serves on the board of a number of other nonprofits, including the New England Young Writers Conference. Matthew has received a BA in English Psychology, an MA in Education, and an MSW from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Prior to his work in education, he served as a writer, actor, and director in Just Kidding production company. William P. and Hazel B. White Professor of English Graduate Program in History and Philosophy of Science, University of Notre Dame, Laura Dassow Walls is the author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life, published by the University of Chicago Press in July 2017, in time to honor Thoreau's 200th birthday. This book, the first full-length comprehensive biography of Thoreau in a generation, draws on extensive new research and the full range of Thoreau's published and unpublished writings to present Thoreau as vigorously alive in all his quirks and contradictions, fully embedded in his place and time, yet speaking powerfully to the problems and perils of today. Her specialty, American Transcendentalism, Literature and Science, Environmental Literature. And back again, Sandra Harbert Petrolinas is Distinguished Professor of English and American Studies at Penn State University. She is the author of To Set This World Right, The Anti-Slavery Movement in Concord, the editor of Thoreau in his own time and co-editor of other works on Thoreau and transcendentalism. Although she read Walden in high school, no one introduced her to the militant Thoreau until graduate school, a deficiency she takes every opportunity to correct with her own students. So welcome all, and I will be turning the forum over to Huey. And please, audience members, text your questions through chat, and at around the 40-minute mark, we'll come back and we'll have a Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, thanks, Mike. And welcome, panelists. We had a chance to chat a little. Great to see you, Sandy, Laura, and Matt, or see you as with quotation marks, I guess. And thank you, all your viewers. All the viewers. We can't see you, but I hope you could see us and hear us. Also accompanying this is a screening of the film I made, Henry David Thoreau, Surveyor of the Soul, and that is available on Vimeo, Films by Huey on Vimeo on demand page. And there's, if you go to the registration or workshop information, there's how to get access to that. And Mike will discuss that at the end of the presentation. So we're going to talk for, I don't know, 40 minutes or so, and then Mike's going to come back and hopefully I encourage you to ask questions, people out there in the audience, of our panelists and myself. It's entitled The Making of the Film Surveyor of the Soul, but we're going to be talking about Henry and his writings and his lifestyle from different perspectives. The film has a lot more people speaking in it than our three esteemed panelists today, but I couldn't get all those people. They would look really like the Brady Bunch if we were on here. But I guess I'll start. Before I ask the first question to our panelists, is just a little background on the film. As Mike pointed out, I've been making films, and this, The Surveyor of the Soul was my 7th feature-length film, and I've done a lot of work with youth in schools, helping them make films, as well as making some what I call for hire films. But most of my films are truly independent in that I'm producer, director, and raise the funds and do all of that, and have many partners. And like the credits of my film, it says a film by Huey, but then the credits go on for 5 minutes at the end of the film. So it isn't just Huey, it's Huey and a whole bunch of other people. And so in making these films, I've always been interested in the arts and education and Maine and nature. And way back when I was at Colby College, in the early days, I met Henry on, I think I tried to read Walden in high school because it was on a list I had of books you need to read to, I don't know, get in college or something, and it didn't work. But then in college, what first reached me were his poems, and interestingly, Smoke, which is in the film, and it was a real special moment to get Robert Bly, our great poet, just to read that. It happened to be one of his favorites too. So then I, worked my way into understanding more about Thoreau, and then sort of, didn't put him aside, but, just thought an interesting person and writer. And then when I was making my film in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Wilderness and Spirit, a mountain called Katahdin, I knew in talking about Katahdin, I had to have a sequence on Henry David Thoreau, one of the early climbers, and of course, writers about Katahdin. And through that, I fell into the vortex of Thoreauvian culture and met all these fellow Thoreauvians, and it was wonderful. And so when I finished that film in 2002, I said, gee, I think I've met all these people. I've done some filming, gone to some of the annual gatherings, and why don't I make a film on Henry David Thoreau? So starting in 2004, I sort of officially started making the film, what we call pre-production. And, Brad Dean, who has since passed away, was instrumental in those early days. And Walter Brain, who you do see in the film and has since passed away after filming his sections in the film, and were also instrumental. And key throughout was Ron Hogue, who was one of the panelists this weekend. So I got started, and it was lucky because in 2005 I did receive some funding, and I was able to film Howard Zinn, who, when I started up again, he was no longer with us, and Robert Bly was still traveling. I don't think he's traveling now. There were other people, and I established friendships with a number of the people that you see in the film that continued on. And then after I finished my film on Marion McPartland, the host of NPR's Marion McPartland's Piano Jazz, that was 2011, Ron said there's a Thoreau scholar you should know about. Her name's Laura Walls. I think we'd maybe met once before, but and she's working on this fantastic book. And even back then, he was right. And so we connected, and the film restarted. And it's through Laura that I met Sandy, and I met Rochelle Johnson and a whole bunch of other people. I think Matt, we connected quite a while ago. I was always intrigued, I think partly because being an artist in residence in schools, I was interested in Thoreau as an educator. So it was great when we finally got to film Matt and his students. And then, so from 2011, we worked, I worked to get it done in 2017 in time for Henry's 200th birthday. So just to, wrap up, one thing I wanted to do in the film was film it as if Henry was filming, I guess. So a lot of the scenes, as much as possible, take place outdoors. And if they aren't, it's because it just didn't work out for that person or that time we were there. There is a lot of footage of Laura speaking, and also Joe Wheeler speaking in the birth room of the Thoreau farm. But most of the films is filmed in Thoreau country and Walden Pond, and also in the Maine woods and other places. So that was one goal. And the other was not only to make a film just about Henry and his time, but make it about Henry in our time and the impact his writings and his lifestyle has on us and on the world we live in today, which I think is quite significant and to me brings history alive. It isn't just something in the past. It is, I think history is, helps us live better lives, if I can use that phrase today. So with all of that preamble, I'll ask our panelists the first question. Some of you may have, audience members have seen the film, but for those that haven't, I'm going to ask each panelist, and I'll start with Matt Schlein, to briefly talk about, what we see you in the film, kind of in general terms, and then sort of get us started a little. What inspired you to do what we see you doing in the film? So we'll start with Matt Schlein, then go to Sandy, then go to Laura. So Matt, please.
Okay, thank you. And it's a real honor to be here and chance to talk with so many Thoreauvians here about the work that I think we all hold so near and dear to our hearts. So I run a program. It's out of the public schools of Vermont. It's called the Walden Project. We just completed our 20th year of doing this. The premise, and you see footage of it in the film, is that the universe is wider than our views of it, certainly wider than the terrible classrooms that one might encounter in America with cinder blocks and bad lighting. And the idea was high school kids in particular, they're dealing with such core questions about their relationship with themselves, their relationship with society. And then I think the key question for our age is, how do we relate to nature? And certainly looking at global climate change, I think it's important that young people are grounded in their understanding of nature, that nature is not something that's abstract to them. I came across a statistic a little while ago, which I should probably verify, but the short of it is that roughly the average American will spend 20 minutes outside, meaning that a week, meaning there are people that wake up in their homes, they go into their garages, they park at their work, and they're in a climate controlled building all day, and rarely are their feet touching the earth. And so the premise of what we do is to, in the spirit of Thoreau, to really ground the students in a sense of place. And I think Thoreau really is a master teacher on so many fronts, but also an amazing role model of what leading an authentic life might mean. And I think particularly for students that are in adolescence, they're asking those questions, and they have a real sense of when things are false or when things are empty. Oftentimes they're forced to deal with edicts that come from the State Department of Education, filtered down to superintendents, to principals, to teachers, and then the student is on the other end. And what we try to do with the Walden Project is to invert that equation, that we say that the learners know what they want out of their education, and that that the model that Thoreau provides by going deep into not deep into those, but into the woods and asking those essential questions, that really should be the model of what the students are engaged on, looking at learning on their own terms, there being a synthesis between, mind and body and the environment, instead of like the typical classroom where students are in rows and their attention is sort of focused always at the teacher. We meet outdoors throughout the entire year. The fire in the center is what commands our attention. We are a heterogeneous mix of students. So there's some students who would meet criteria of what you call gifted and talented. There's some that are in the middle, not causing too much trouble, not necessarily doing a great job, but not doing a terrible job. And then a third of the kids are the biggest troublemakers in the school. And the idea was that we wanted it to be a heterogeneous mix of students. That we wanted it to be a microcosm of the larger culture. And so, we limit it to 20 students per year. They're all from the public schools in Vermont. Through Vermont, there's a thing called school choice, so that we do have students who can come from other districts and be part of the program. There's no cost. It's sort of part of the public school system, which I think is part of the amazing thing about what it is that we do. And there's a lot to say about the curriculum, but the short form, gathering in the late summer, going into the cold darkness and emerging on the spring on the other side. We see that as metaphoric to the process of creating identity that the students are going through. And it's not uncommon that at the very, very beginning of the year, they'll look around either side of the fire and be like, oh my God, I'm going to be in community with you. And then at the end of the year, this person that they've written off as other suddenly becomes very, very intimate, a very, very intimate understanding that they develop by, experiencing nature, experiencing learning, creating a sense of community. And, I again, for me, encountering Walden when I first in high school, but sort of becoming mesmerized in college. And I had been teaching for 6 years in the public schools, English, drama, and psychology. And I hit that crossroads that a lot of teachers in the public schools hit, where, it's like there's a lot that's wrong, but what could be better? And I'd actually had a student that I was very close with, at the age of 22, passed away from a heart attack. And the last conversation I had with him was the seed of this idea for the Walden Project. And he said, this is such a good idea. You need, the schools need this, the kids need this. And the truth of the matter is I need this, because I feel like it's been an incredibly satisfying professional life to just be in a small community with students, asking big questions, and using Thoreau as sort of like a guide to understand, these questions of epistemology, these questions of identity. And, I would say if we wound up 20 years of this, there's a huge number of our students have gone on and many of them are parents, and doing all range of work, from education to the arts. But we did do a survey. I'm going to sort of wind it up because there are a lot of wonderful people on this panel that I know everyone wants to hear from. But we asked the students just some feedback, and every single one of them said that if they had a child or a family member that they would recommend Walden to their students, that they developed a much more deep relationship with nature through the experience, and they rated it as their favorite year of education throughout their public education. So, this idea of being in community, being connected to each other, again, with Thoreau as the lens for the discourse, has been a really, really meaningful. And it was an honor to be part of the film and just to sort of show the really significant way that Thoreau's vision still is alive today in young people and continues to inspire them. And I guess was one last closing thing. The Walden Project, we have a sister school in New York called the Walden Project New York, and Andy Webster, we've been working with him, and he's developing another sort of pod of young Thoreau scholars out there. So thanks for listening, and be happy to answer questions, but I definitely want to turn it over to some of the illustrious other members on this panel.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, it was Judy, my wife, and I. She was helped out on many of the shoots, and that was one of our more enjoyable shoots, as we call it in the film biz, was going up to Vermont, and then we had that great screening that Becky Gould held for us at Middlebury College, where they came. So moving to Sandy Petrolinas, it appears in the film mainly on the Concord anti-slavery movement, and Thoreau's does a wonderful job explaining Thoreau's one night in jail. I'd like you to elaborate on that and a brief thing about how you came to develop that topic that you expressed so well in the film.
Thank you. Thank you, Huey, for asking me to be part of this film in the first place, and then also to get to talk with this group today. And Laura and Matt, it's a pleasure to be talking with both of you. Laura, I haven't seen you for years and years, all of 2 years, so hello. So my contribution to the film, as Huey just explained, was to bring, it's entitled Surveyor of the Soul, the film, and my goal was to bring Thoreau's political soul to bear on the subject, along with all of the other perspectives, of course, to put that conversation with everyone else's comments. In resistance to civil government, as most of you, and probably all of you phoning in today know, he calls for men to live according to action from principle. His abolitionism, which evolves over, I would say, 15 or so years, shows him finally answering that call to an increasing extent, even to the extent, of course, of supporting someone like John Brown, who's been called lots of things, but whom we can all appreciate was an abolitionist zealot, martyr, if you will. So for students, especially when I teach and also in the work that I've published, I'm very interested in emphasizing this evolution in Thoreau's thinking as an anti-slavery person, as a reformer, because it parallels, of course, the increasing agitation that the United States is experiencing as we move from the 1830s and 40s up until the eve of the Civil War. So Thoreau moves in resistance to civil government and the talks that became that essay to a night in jail, a nonviolent protest, which of course resonated far more for later reformers than it did for Thoreau himself or for those in his time. But he says that he is quietly declaring war with the state in that essay. Spin forward 5-6 years to the situation in Boston that is protesting the fugitive slave law. In 1854, in the essay that becomes known as Slavery in Massachusetts, he says his thoughts are murder to the state, and I involuntarily go plotting against her. And little pencil scribbles up above the line of that statement in his journal, he says, I am calculating how many miscreants each honest man can dispose of. That's quite an evolution. I was, mind you, quite proud to discern that counsel that had eluded my dissertation director at the time. But you know, quite a radical claim, quite an evolution in my view, at least at that time, in my thinking, from a guy who said his thoughts were, or that his action was a quiet declaration of war with the state. And then spin forward another 5 years, of course, to John Brown and a plea for Captain John Brown, a talk he gave 3 times. And he's condoning violence. He is saying that he doesn't know, he's not saying whether he would kill or be killed, but he can imagine scenes in which both would be possible. He says that the Sharps rifles and revolvers were at last used in a righteous cause. So this is not a guy who really belongs, in my view, on that T-shirt with Gandhi and King. His, not to take away from their pacifist movements and their nonviolent commitments, which were hugely important and influential in their lives. But that is not who Henry Thoreau was, and certainly not who he became in his ultimate evolution on that topic. I initially became interested in this subject all as a result of writing an annotation. So beware, graduate students, if you're out there tuning in, you never know where an annotation and a footnote is going to lead you. It might take over your life. In my case, it took over a good decade and a little longer. I was trying to figure out what inspired slavery in Massachusetts, which of course led me to Anthony Burns and the very famous court case that ultimately returned him to his enslaver in Virginia. And I needed to learn what upset Thoreau so much, what had caused him to care about this man named Anthony Burns. Certainly reading Walden back in high school, which we had to do back in those days, I'd never encountered slavery in Massachusetts. I'd never heard of John Brown. I wanted to know more about this Henry and this radical voice. And so as I went down that rabbit hole, I naively thought that I was going to figure out all the names and dates of all the enslaved people who self-emancipated their way up to Concord and on to further freedom in northern places. And I would find this whole network of people whom Thoreau helped. That didn't happen. Like many people before me, the book I ended up writing was not the one I thought I was writing when I started. What I instead learned is that Thoreau and Emerson and many of the other prominent voices that gave rise to Concord being called a hotbed of abolitionism was actually a result of a network of civic activism that was initiated by people I'd never heard of, except as in a few cases, their last names were Thoreau and Emerson, but they weren't Henry and Waldo, and Alcott's as well. But largely they were people whose names meant nothing to me. Mary Merrick Brooks, Ann Bigelow, Mary Rice, Susan and Ellen Garrison, who were 2 African-American members of an organization that was founded called the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1837. And as some of you who are tuned in probably know, that's a rabbit hole I could stay talking about now for the next couple of hours. So I'll move on to say that, like Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, thanks to these women and a few of the men who were also helping the women at that time in Concord, they became, these 2 transcendentalists, much more outspoken on the subject of slavery, particularly as the fugitive slave law brought slavery very really, tangibly, literally to Massachusetts by insisting that the neighbors of many African Americans actually help return them to their enslaved condition. There's very little documentation of the Underground Railroad in Concord, but Henry and his family certainly participated in it. We know that in at least 2 or 3 occasions. We have the details for those, and there were probably far more that we don't know about. And certainly we know that by 1859, John Brown paid his 2nd visit to Concord, in fact, spent his last 59th birthday in Concord with friends. And we know that Henry Thoreau had a pretty starring role in the aftermath of Harper's Ferry by driving one of the escaped raiders to the train station, and so that he could make it to freedom. Much more risky venture than his night in jail 10 years earlier, or actually 13 years earlier, excuse my math. And a lot of drama to that. So I'll leave it there. If we have time for questions on that subject, I'll certainly be happy to give it more. One quick thing about John Brown that I'm happy to point out too is that Huey, I always loved the title of the film, especially because Thoreau appreciated greatly the fact that he had in common with John Brown the fact that they had both been surveyors in all the ways that he made that a very rich metaphor between their shared profession.
Right, yes. And Sandy's book, To Set This World Right, got me to thinking a lot and opened a whole new world. And that's one reason I wanted her in the film, and I appreciate that she did that. And as you saw, she's quite, can evoke the time and place for us in Thoreau's thinking, and the key figures that influenced his life in the female anti-slavery society. And Laura Walls, who, I don't know if you had had already actually in 2011 started writing, but we were both, I know you were in the early stages, so it was very interesting for me to have a lead scholar that Laura was, and I like to think of as friend now and colleague, that we were both developing these large creative works, and it was great for me to see a writer thinking about how they develop a work, in your case, the biography of Henry Thoreau. But there's so much that you can talk about, but I was sort of thinking you might perhaps start a little on his humanness, but I think you have your own thoughts on this, so I'll let you take it away.
Well, I think I'll get there to the end. And, thanks, Matt and Sandy, both. Many lines of thinking here, and I'm afraid I'm going to introduce still more. So I had been, was starting to research the book and think about what a biography of Thoreau might look like and what it would need to look like, but I was far from writing when we first started. So yes, the evolution was all along through that period. Which would suggest that the Surveyor of the Soul is a biopic. I would say not exactly. I mean, it's interesting how we were working in tandem, but they're very different kinds of projects, even though they intersect so much. What I think is true of the film, and it's Huey because of your, I think, distinctive filmmaking style. The film is not a biopic because that sort of has the traditional narrative line, a biographical line, more as my biography does. But the film has this whole other approach to telling the story, which is to bring in, dozens of people and their voices, young people, older people, well-known people, and people who are just literally, you see somebody put a camera in their face and say, talk about why you're here. What does Thoreau mean to you? And it's extraordinary. It makes the film something more like an event that in the making gathered people together around Thoreau. And the amazing thing, since watching it in 2017 and as it continues, it's an event that continues to be happening even like right now at this moment. It continues to gather people as today around this, around who Thoreau was and what he continues to mean to us, and a meaning which continues to grow and evolve. And so it creates a community. Walden Thoreau creates a community, and the film activates and continues to create that community. So, it's thinking about that as I wrote the biography was very much part of my mind in terms of how was Thoreau part of a community, and how did that make all the difference in how we need to understand who Thoreau was and how he got to be that way. Not at all the isolated person of the sort of mythic hermit, no. So I got really engaged with that that side of how to tell that story alongside the film. Anyway, think about the film's title. Surveyor of the Soul. And so thanks, Sandy, for pointing out the coincidence with John Brown, or maybe not merely coincidence. So that points back to the famous illustration of the survey, a thorough survey of the pond, which is the only illustration in the text of Walden. We have Sophia's drawing on the frontispiece, of course. And it's a real interesting question to ask of that. Why does Thoreau provide a survey of the pond rather than the much more conventional and expected gesture of perhaps providing an illustration, a picture? So why a survey? And then, of course, why of the soul? And so I know this title was Huey's title, so I think Huey was probably thinking this through in various ways. To me, you know, my first initial thought was, well, soul, that's inner, right? Inward, maybe even a kind of navel gazing, right? Thoreau was at Walden Pond to sort of develop his self, his inner gaze, and self-identity. And that's not it at all, as it turns out. And as you watch the film, you watch how this concept evolves. The point of the survey in Walden, in the illustration in Walden, is to demonstrate, as Thoreau's text tells us, that to survey is an act. And Thoreau's writing about doing the survey makes clear that it's an exploration of character, even of ethics. And in the film, Patrick Chora helps us see this. He's an experienced surveyor himself, and so he sort of walks it through and shows how in performing the survey and looking at, drawing it, and then as we look at the survey, we're all repeating this act of relating, most obviously on the survey itself, the house to the pond to the railroad, and each of them to each other. If you think about that symbolically, you've got you know, the self relating to nature and vice versa, and both of those relating to, well, the railroad, but in a larger sense, technology, or to the social and political, wider human world. And so this is fundamentally transcendentalist. Transcendentalism is all about how the personal self, call it the soul, if you like, is created, or in transcendentalist terms, drawn out, or cultured, or speaking as a teacher, educated, educing the self, right? In interaction with the world, or in interdependence, even more strongly in interdependence with the world. So what that phrase points to is the spiritual capacity of the person to seek meaning by relating to the other, that's the way that we find meaning. So the other can be other persons, and this is the social Thoreau that you know, we think of relating to human persons, or that you know, trying to bring in that element that he tends to be less interested in, even though it's very present. What he does focus on is relating to non-human persons, right? Or I like the phrase parahuman. But yes, so the wider world of including all living beings, and by the way, living includes you know, the pond, the earth, the sky, the rocks, the fundament. So larger systems, relating to larger systems, and that can be natural systems, which Thoreau became an expert in, but also social systems, political systems, like what Sandy works with, systemic racism. Think about systemic, system, racism as a system that Thoreau is seeking to identify and understand in his time apart from society at the pond, or relating to the ultimate purpose of our life and the conduct of our life. So this is Thoreau at Walden. This is what surveying the soul means. It's not inner at all. It begins with an inner contemplation, but the whole point is how it goes out to the world and to action in the world. So I see a film about how we do this. It's about how Thoreau models this. This reciprocal action of self in the world, but the film enacts it for us and all the people that the film shows, and it shows that this is about ethics, ethical life. I'm very interested in this, would say this is religious or spiritual, at least, perhaps even religious, which I think is exactly right in the largest sense. And how? Because we respond to Thoreau's call, right? This is call in the sense of a calling. We hear the call. It's a vocation. We feel called. We who are listening right now are part of this, right? And you think, well, what's the call? Well, this is Thoreau of the motto, the rooster, right? Wake up, wake up. At the caller at the crack of dawn, the watcher calling to us to awake. And it's been interesting to listen to our accounts. I mean, those of us who've spoken how we came to Thoreau often have said, we heard a call. We picked up maybe civil disobedience, or in some cases, Walden, we heard a call. It woke us up to some injustice, some lack, some need. And so we've become a community of readers. But of course, this is Thoreau we're reading, so it's more than that. Thoreau enjoins us to act in the world. And so he draws us together, he holds us together, gives us contemplative inspiration and encouragement, each in our own way, to work for change in the world, towards a more just world. But that's where the whole human life phrase comes in. I wanted that to be the subtitle of the book, and the publisher said, that's too much, too many words, too complicated, just a life. But I wanted it to be Henry David Thoreau, a whole human life, to emphasize this, because I felt so strongly that we need to keep Thoreau from being unfairly and wrongly dismissed. I think we're turning a corner on this, but a few years ago, some of us were really in despair because there are so many who either out of just sheer ignorance, they don't know, or they're just following convention, or maybe even out of malice, distort his meaning and shut it down by calling him, the rank individualist or a hermit or irrelevant to today, too self-involved, selfish. That is so damaging because we need figures from our past to help us today. And that shuts down Thoreau from being known by those who might otherwise hear and also respond to Thoreau's call. I know I did. It was civil disobedience for me too. And I was a kid watching my big brothers and sisters go off and demonstrate against the Vietnam War. I got very exercised and tried to pull this into my high school. And yeah, civil disobedience, and then Walden gave me a lot of courage.
Good, thank you. You explained the title much better than I could.
Well, one of the things I was just casting I was looking at Natural History Massachusetts, and Thoreau at the end of it says, one must look a long time before one can see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a whole other story I can tell of the title with Brad Dean, but we got so much to get to and so little time here. I'm thinking maybe just a quick, I don't know, can you do a 1 minute each? I think one reason I picked the three of you was that, education, civil rights, or, the racial issues that, and as Laura just explained, living today, the importance of nature are all just right in front of us right now. And I'll just quickly start with Laura. It seems a little off topic, but like Henry died of TB, but we're in a pandemic. I mean, was it a pandemic at all? And I guess I'm going to have to ask you to be quick about this.
Yeah, sure.
And then, can we make that, or am I pushing that limit to our pandemic and the TB?
Yeah. No, I had the same question when we all started sheltering, and I thought about how massively put upon, and we've all felt it at the need to worry about this because there was no cure, and still is no cure, right, for COVID. And the kind of, well, wait a minute, there's always a cure. I mean, you go to a doctor, you get vaccinated, you get a cure, you get treated. And the scary thing was suddenly we're plunged into this world where there just is none. And so suddenly it becomes a social problem and a public health crisis, and it spreads all around the world. And nobody knows, nobody understood what was happening and still don't understand what happens with COVID, and we all feel so vulnerable, and it's changing our social systems, our family structures, our work structures, our attitude about life. And it hit me. That was what TB, or tuberculosis, felt like in New England in Thoreau's day. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. My God, these people, the courage that they had to go out and live their lives vigorously and fully, when they all knew, and they all had family members who were either suffering from TB or were dying of it or had died of it, and they all knew that could be them. And so suddenly I had a new appreciation for not just the vulnerability of our life, but the sense of vulnerability that they all felt in Thoreau's world. And yet they, like Sandy's, the women that Sandy documents, they all had to go out and enact these lives in the world in ways that took tremendous courage, just that we have forgotten because we're sort of bubbled and insulated in a way that they weren't. So my admiration for them all is going way, way up.
Right. It gives you a little hope in our time.
Well, also a sense of identification. I think I got something about them that I hadn't quite before.
And Sandy, we're just going to completely change the topics. I mean, we have in the film Spencer Crew, who was a scholar in the film from George Mason University, is now I just found out, acting director of Museum of African American History, and why he's too busy to take part today. He talks about that the Underground Railroad, and many people think, is the first integrated working or organization, if it was pretty loose, in its time. Are we about, with Black Lives Matter and the protests we're seeing around George Floyd, seeing that integration that has to happen in order for Black lives to matter as they should?
Well, that would be a big answer for me to give as far as the looking glass into the future. But what I would say is I certainly hope so. I've been encouraged by the looks of the crowds, the makeup of the crowds, and I've heard an awful lot of scholars of African American history and sociologists saying the same thing. Various TV programs and social media being thrilled that the allies are out there, and that I just have the greatest respect. First of all, let's get this out there for Generation Z and the millennials. If these kids don't save the world, no one's going to, because the courage. I mean, Laura, you talk about courage of the anti-slavery women, and I'm right there with you, of course. But the courage of these young people standing there, confronting riot gear and SWAT teams, and just absolutely knowing their rights, being informed, encouraging each other, and watching the leaders take it on and the allies back away and know what their place is too, that they're there to support but not to lead, and for everyone to be informed. I think that we are at dare I call it an inflection point. It certainly makes teaching the Transcendentalists, teaching Thoreau, teaching the anti-slavery, the formation of the anti-slavery movement from the grassroots people you've never heard of, all the more relevant. And it makes my students just fired up and interested to learn who the forebears were of what they want to go out and do right now. So often my students have said, oh gosh, you guys got to live through the 60s, there's nothing like that anymore. And of course, by the end of the class, they know better. But
Mhm.
now we turn on the TV and they know all the more how much there still remains to be done. And I just hope so, Huey. And I like to believe that certainly Thoreau would be right out there saying, I told you to let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. Let's keep throwing sand. let's get it stopped for once and for all.
And that's what he said, philosophy into action. So those of us who, can take an easy way out, we can't. We have
Exactly.
to take part and commit action. And Sandy brings up the young people, so we're back to Matt. And, in terms of education and young people, the Walden Project facing, here we are meeting virtually, and I've been teaching virtually as the other panelists have. What do you see as the future of education, the importance of nature to our students from your viewpoint as someone teaching around a fireplace in the woods?
Yeah, I mean, I thanks for the question. I think everyone is aware of the challenges of global climate change. I think though nature can be an abstraction to students, I think there's this idea I need to care about the planet, but people don't have a dynamic relationship with their ecology around them. And what I see going on with the students at the Walden Project is an opportunity to develop an authentic relationship with nature, and sort of the surprises and awe and wonder that nature can provide. There's one of my favorite stories that happened during the time at Walden. It was our first year, it was our final trip, and we had gone to a campsite up in the New Haven River in the backcountry of Vermont. And the spot where we were camping, a tree had fallen, and it had fallen on a moose that we think had been drinking water. And this was a springtime trip, a mid to late spring, so it's cold up here. The back half of the moose had been picked clean by coyotes, but the front end had been in ice and was like this mottled mess. And so as a group, we all like lifted up the tree, and we had this sort of funeral for the moose. And I don't know where that story fits within like a grading rubric or anything like that, but it's one of those experiences that you got this incredible sense of like just the power of nature, like the anaerobic stink from this moose, but you could see sort of that interplay between life and death. You could see there's a hope that comes. One of the things this was not by design when we started Walden, but as a consequence, the large number of our students who have dealt with parents or family members who have some serious illness or have died, and this idea of kind of coming to nature, it allows us to be comfortable with death. Like, it's by living close to life, we can live more comfortably with death. And in terms of young people today, I think they need that vibrancy that nature provides, that context. And so, again, I think you're sort of using Thoreau as our rooster to sort of wake folks up, but that he was very much this like dialectic tension between himself and the natural world and society, and really involving the youth in that rich dialectic.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all. I think Mike might pop in pretty soon here with some questions from our viewers, audience. Yeah, in the film, Laura does a wonderful job talking about, and Rochelle Johnson as well, the Thoreau facing the death of his brother and the impact that had on his life. And I see that as a number of ways. One, we're learning about Thoreau, but it's also how going to nature, as you alluded to, Matt, was what saved him. And he, as Laura says in the film, seeing John in nature kept him alive in some ways, and helped Henry to stay alive and live more.
I just would add, we were speaking earlier in another webinar about the quotation, "Surely joy is the condition of life." So I went back, that's why I was reading Natural History of Massachusetts, and that's literally what Thoreau wrote as coming out of grief for John. some of the first writing he did was to say that, and then to look at, and wonderful passage where he looks at around him and sort of validates that statement by saying, look, 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 look. And the whole essay is just look, right? And it's, I don't know, somehow this one essay, his very first, struck me this reading as immensely powerful exactly in that way.
Yeah, and here in Maine, I'll wrap up and Mike can take over, is when the pandemics, we were supposed to all isolate. The first thing that happened was everybody started going to the state parks and beaches and walking outside. And I noticed, I walk every day, and I noticed the number of walkers increased dramatically. Of course, people are at home and there's a lot to deal with. But I think that's what they needed, getting out in nature. In fact, it was so much because of the pandemic, they had to close some of the state parks because they were worried about too many people. But I think it just showed our need for nature instinctively to help us heal and find our way in the world. So throw it to Mike. I see his back.
Thank you. I've been listening with great interest to this conversation. And we do have some questions from the audience. And let's see. So one person asks, a question for Professor Walls. Many sources, including the Thoreau family tree on the Thoreau Society website, give John Thoreau Jr.'s year of birth as 1815. Your book makes it clear that he was born on July 5th, 1814. Is the source of this fact from Tom Blanding's article in the spring 1980 Thoreau Society Bulletin? And are there other sources proving John Jr. was born in a year earlier than is generally thought?
Oh, wow. That's getting into the weeds. I hate to say this, but I would have to go back into the weeds and look up my source. The thing about writing a biography, getting the family tree down was structurally foundational, that and the timeline. And so I would have been doing that research around 2012, 2013. And of course, adding to it as new things came. But boy, I'd have to get down into my notebooks and find the exact source. But I remember finding discussions of when was John born, both the day and the year seemed to be problematic. So I did what you got to do when your sources conflict, was I had to go with what seemed to me to be the most authoritative and solid of the sources. But which one it was, golly gee. Mercy, that's why we're writers. If we could hold it all in our head, we wouldn't have to write it all down.
Okay, so I have a second question, and it's from Jane Gordon, and it's actually something I think would be, I'd also like to ask each of you, and that's in terms of Thoreau scholarship, and just thinking about the evolution of Thoreau scholarship. I don't know if the beginnings of it is with the early Riverside Press editions in the 80s and 90s, and then into the Depression era, and then with the founding of the Thoreau Society in 1941, and with all of the scholarship that's occurred. And it's you think on the one hand plugging away at Thoreau for over a century now, that we may have come to the end of the lines. Of course, we all know that that's not true. And so Jane is asking, what aspects of Thoreau's life and legacy would each of the four of you like to investigate next? And I'd like to sort of contextualize that a bit by saying, and also wondering about the direction and future of Thoreau scholarship. If you could each sort of give some thought to that.
I'll start with that if it's okay. I'm working on a couple of projects now that are not directly related to Thoreau, but what we need, and I know they're working on it rapidly, and what I hope is at the top of the priority list for everyone, is the continued and completed edition of his journal, the Princeton University Press edition of his journal. We still have quite a number of volumes to come in the print edition, and then immediately turning the entire run of his journal into a digital edition. There's just a huge need for that. All of us who are working on Thoreau to any extent find ourselves needing to cite both the old and the new journal. And Laura, certainly you know better than anyone how much is missing from the 1906 edition. So, you know, I'm sorry that's not more idea driven, but my answer to this is we've got to have the text, and that's the central text of the man's life. So that's where I would put all the priorities, attention and grant money that we can get.
I'll jump in there because the other one, and Brad Dean was working on this, and when we lost Brad, this manuscript went into deep storage. The transliteration of the Indian books, the 12 Indian notebooks, and Thoreau and the Indian, as in his term, remains a huge aspect of his life. He identified from even childhood with this figure of the Indian, which continued to grow and evolve throughout his life. It's a complex question, and many-folded, complicated as well, and absolutely crucial to our understanding, not just of Thoreau, but of our own relationship to the Native Americans, the people who were here before we who are European descent, before we came, and his very vexed and complicated, but still for him a site of growth. We need that to be done. It's a career. It's not just a book. Somebody needs to be really invested in this as a career. I find that to be the deepest absence. It's not what I'm working on. I don't feel unqualified for that, but somebody needs to be.
As the least scholarly member of the panel, I'm going to sort of refer back to what Huey had said with this idea of philosophy and action, and I really that's one of the things I really appreciate about Thoreau is sort of it's not just this sort of brilliant brain, but it's like how does that mind intersect with the world in all of its complexities. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in is like his legacy in terms of how this guy who died in relative obscurity in his time has had such a significant impact upon the world, and just to have a larger understanding of the breadth of inspiration that people continue to draw from his work.
Yeah, and I've been working quite a while with the Penobscot Nation and did artist in residency at Indian Island School, and been talking with James Francis about I'm hoping, perhaps to do a film, not just Thoreau related, but to help the Penobscot remake a film about, Penobscot people today and the river, and under James's guidance. And I would love to have that happen. The COVID, thing has interrupted that. So I'm hoping we can pick it up and move forward on that. And the other aspect is young people and understanding who Thoreau is and the lessons they can learn from his life and writings. And I see a number of things from my teaching, but also I think there's a real story in that time of life when he was trying to go from graduating from Harvard, and would start a little during Harvard, and meeting Emerson, the transcendentalist, trying to make it and failing in Staten Island, and then the death of his brother, and not pulling off his love for Ellen Sewell. All of that seems like to be something that a lot of young people could associate with. And then so it's sort of all unresolved in my mind, but that seems to be something that could appeal to young people, and I haven't figured out what it is yet, but I think there's something there.
And just to real quickly build on your point, Huey, people are like, well, his mom did his laundry, he went into town to get by at the Emerson house. the students love that contradiction, you know, like this, like the you know, because it's something that they can relate to. I mean, he was just like looking to live an authentic life. And I think, you know, people think Thoreau, oh, you know, but he was just like us, trying to make sense of his times and trying to be an authentic person. And I think those contradictions and I think those struggles really sort of inform and make him more accessible.
Well, I think that the laundry quip is usually angst against the ninth grade English teacher or something like that. But so, you know, Thoreau as a writer, it's interesting to me how he sort of evolved, and his early interest was in poetry. And I think at Emerson's suggestion, he even picked up Chalmers' History of the English Poets, which is something, I don't know, like 50,000 words. I think the Princeton University Press keeps that on their shelf, but I'm not sure anybody's ever read all of it other than our hero Henry. But you know, and he did read it, and it was an immense undertaking. And to think of his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, that he did put some of his poetry into that book. He was trying to become a poet, and with the literary failure of that book, it just recently occurred to me that he essentially gives up his poetry. And the thing that he takes up after around that time is surveying. So in some sense, I think his early writings, to me, I mean, if you think of essays like The Service and some of those real early essays, are somewhat ungrounded, and that Thoreau, as he turns to surveying, becomes much more grounded. And so I love the title of your film, Huey, Surveyor of the Soul, because it both you know, entails going inward, which Thoreau did, and going outward, and that he seemed to be fairly comfortable in both of those realms. And I love to think his concept of wildness is about the inner realms of the human spirit as well as the natural world. And so this kind of brings me back to the question about scholarship and Thoreau, and sort of, I don't know, I like to kind of search for overarching models for things. So thinking about Thoreau's work with the Indian notebooks, you know, and doing that in his Indian work, that connects with his map making project that we didn't know about until maybe 10 or 12 years ago, when John Hessler at the Library of Congress discovered a couple of maps that Thoreau was making. And these weren't tracings, but actual maps that Thoreau began working on. And it's interesting to think that as a surveyor, he also moved to cartography, which is moving from the small, the micro, to the macro. And that part of his map project apparently was to look at where Native peoples lived geographically in the Champlain region. And while he's doing that project, which never came to fruition, he's also doing his calendar work in Concord, a project that Kristen Case has taken some interest in Thoreau's calendar work. And these are basically the notes and charts that Thoreau kept, and cross-reference to his journal on the flora and fauna of Concord that Richard Primack from BU has been using to study climate science. So you know, together there's this trajectory that's coming together, in my mind anyway. And you know, in many ways, for me, thinking about Thoreau as scientist began when, well, I first read Laura's book, Seeing New Worlds, and I listened to her speak at BU, I don't know, over 22 years ago at this point. But just how all of that work, Brad Dean's work with the dispersion of seeds and wild fruits, we now have this comprehensive Thoreau that we didn't, well, when I was in graduate school, in the mid 90s didn't really exist, certainly not to my mind.
Mhm.
And now we have it, and I think it entails an awful lot of comparative studies, like Robert Thorson getting involved in Thoreau and the Rivers.
Mhm.
That now it's taken, several professions are taking a look at Thoreau now to begin to piece him together. So, well, I just wanted to sort of end on this note, because this is our concluding session. I think that the film sort of opens things up a bit, and well, since I've been running the webinars, I feel I get to have the last word. So,
Go for it.
so I'd like to leave us thinking about the future of Thoreau studies. And Matt, thank you for keeping Thoreau's legacy alive within your Walden School. And each of you, thank you for the conversation today. Sandy, for your involvement in 3 sessions during the webinar. And Laura, for participating in 2. And Huey, for all of your good work and networking, helping to work and make available the Penobscot film that we have available on Vimeo. And I encourage viewers today to go and watch Surveyor of the Soul, which is available on Vimeo, and we have a link to it on our website, and they can view it for half the price with the code Thoreau, lowercase. And I highly recommend viewing that film. And before I finally conclude, is there anything that the 4 of you would like to add? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just
Thank you.
say, I'll give the shop at Walden Pond a plug to take it down the Kraus commercial area here. The DVD is available on my website, but I urge you to, if you want to see the DVD, to go to the shop at Walden Pond, and they're selling it. You know, it helps the Thoreau Society through their revenue, and it's as sort of a semi-outsider. They're a wonderful group of people. I really love getting together at these gatherings. We always have incredible discussions and meet these amazing people and from all around the world. And so supporting the society is important. And so I'm glad I can help out a little by, having folks buy the DVD. And thank you again, Mike. And thank all the panelists for helping in the film and helping today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Huey. Well, I'd also like to thank Thoreau Farm, and we're hosting here at the Thoreau Birth House and the room that Thoreau was born in. Also, special thanks to Orchard House for sponsoring this afternoon's session. And also to my board of directors, the Thoreau Society Board of Directors, who sort of conceived of this project of having these webinars back during our April meeting. And particularly to Ron Hogue and Rochelle Johnson, who were very involved in helping to put together the webinars. And then most especially, the reason we all come together and do this work is because of Thoreau Society members who have been a big part of this story of Thoreau's legacy and the scholarship that is ongoing. So thank you to the Thoreau Society membership. And with that, we conclude. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Everyone.
Thank you all. Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.